Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Home Invasion Turned Creepy by Spooky Mennonite. I'm still pretty jarred from this experience, but I figured it would be easier to share about it than keep dwelling on it. A couple days ago, someone broke into my house while I was asleep. I work night shift, so sleeping during the day is something you learn to get used to. Around 6:30 p.m., I heard what I thought was a loud knocking sound coming from outside, and my dog's going absolutely ballistic. For reference, I live on a farm out in the middle of nowhere. My closest neighbor is a half a mile away. But back to the story. I somewhat woke up but didn't really think anything of it since my neighbors like to shoot their guns and this was hunting season. As I started falling back asleep, my head started fluttering weird like I knew something wasn't right. That's when I heard loud footsteps throughout the house. The dogs were still barking but started to quiet down. And that's when I really began to worry. When I think my dogs would protect me at a time like that, fat chance. The footsteps stopped on the other side of my bedroom door and didn't move. I think this is how I'm going to die, and although I had a weapon in my room, I knew I couldn't get it without being heard. It felt like an eternity before the steps moved around and towards my brother's room. I could hear rustling loudly through the house and things being thrown, and I knew they were in my brother's room. Some of his friends are into seedy situations, and I knew it had to be one of them. I heard the footsteps coming back to my door, and the doorknob handle moved. I immediately turned my back towards the door and closed my eyes tight, a hand over my mouth to stop from screaming. The door opened, but that was it. Then he left as a car drove down the road, and I finally bucked up my courage and got out of bed. Everything in the house, except for my brother's room, was undisturbed. I immediately called my brother and asked if any of his friends were coming over, and he said that he didn't know of any, and I told him what happened. He got off the phone with me to start calling around. I went back to bed and noticed that I still had my window cracked over from earlier and realized I had my sheet off of me wearing only a t-shirt to bed. If it was who I thought it was, that was not a random event. One of my brother's friends had always had eyes for me, and the fact that he saw me sleeping in just a t-shirt makes me freak out. Whether or not he took something out of my brother's room or knew I was home alone sleeping before having to work later that night, I don't know. You move out to the country to get away from the activity of city life and you let your guard down. That's when something like this happens. Sometimes country life isn't so safe after all. My Skinwalker Story by Mandog V1. To preface this, I'm somewhere in the middle of a skeptic and a believer in the paranormal, so take my story how you will. I'm just recounting what I saw. My dad is from a small village in southern Mexico in the rainforest, a very third world country type of place. No internet, no hot water, people still speak Mayan. When I was 18, we visited for the first time when he got his papers fixed, and it was a beautiful experience. The second day we were there was a Sunday, so everyone in the village goes to church. We go start meeting people, and a very old couple, I don't know what age they were, but they looked like they were in their 80s, came up to us and started talking to us in Mayan. We don't know it, so our family was translating for it, and a long story short, turns out that they were witches, and they lived up in the mountains, and every Sunday they came down to church, walking, and it takes them 6 hours to get there, and another 6 to get back. I brushed that off and we went home. A few hours later, they showed up at our grandma's house. My aunt told my dad that we had to offer them something and they'll go away and leave us alone. So I played along, and my dad does this. He gets 2 bags and fills them with food and drinks. Then they go on their way, but before they did, The lady walked up to my mom and told her something in Mayan with a big smile on her face. They left, and my mom asked my aunt what she said, and my aunt said to the lady and told my mom, "I want to take you home with me and eat you." At that point, the whole situation was weird, and we weren't really sure what to think about this whole time and the whole witch thing, but it was over. Or I thought it was. Around 5:30 p.m., I was bored and decided to go for a little walk to the river about 15 minutes away. When I was almost there, I noticed that it started to get dark and rain clouds started to form. I was already almost there, so I decided to keep going. As soon as I got to the river, it started to rain like crazy, and there were thunderstorms. The sky was now completely dark. There were no streetlights out there of any sorts, so it was pitch black. I started walking back disappointed because I wanted to chill there. Around 5 minutes into my walk back in the rain and darkness, I saw a silhouette about 40 feet away. It was something on all fours, so I thought it was my family's dog. He would follow us whenever we walked anywhere. This would have been a pretty big dog in this case, which he was. I wasn't alarmed. I walked closer, calling his name out, and as I got closer, I swear to God, I saw this thing start to go slowly from all fours to standing up. Keep in mind it was pitch black out, so all I was really seeing was a silhouette. I wasn't really freaking out in that moment. I think I was just too shocked to have a reaction to what was going on. But as I got closer, this thing was standing up and walking. And what would you know? As we walked past each other, I could finally make out what it was, and it was the old witch lady from earlier. From there, I sped walk home and never looked back. I told my family, and they told me there's stories of skinwalkers, but they never believed them. We never saw the old lady again after that, not even at church the next week. I don't know what I saw, but my guess would be that that lady is actually a witch, and she can skinwalk. So, there's my true story. Hope you enjoyed it. I almost got kidnapped by a fake hotel employee, by Burnt Rat 13. This happened when I was 10 years old. I was at a ski resort with my dad, stepmom, and 3 sisters. When this happened, my 2 sisters, dad, and stepmom were still out skiing, but me and my sister Ava got cold, so we went back to the hotel to get some food. We sat at the restaurant in the hotel until my stepmom came down. We asked her if she could hold the table so we could go up to the room quickly and then we could drop off our ski jackets. So we took the elevator, and once we got off, we started to walk to our room. That's when I heard someone behind me go, "Hey!" Keep in mind, we were both 11 at the time. I didn't think he was talking to us, so I just ignored it. We walked into our room, but before we could close the door, the man stepped in the doorway. He was tall, probably about 6 foot, and he looked old, maybe in his early 60s or late 50s, and he was wearing the hotel staff uniform, but just without the logos. The thing that raised a big red flag was that he was wearing black surgical gloves. He said, "Hey, I was talking to you." And we spun around, caught off guard, and Ava says, "Us?" And he goes, "Yeah, you. I was wondering if you could grab a pitcher for me and come into my room to pour some water for me." Our parents told us to never trust strangers, and we already got a bad vibe from him, so we politely declined. His tone then got a bit annoyed, and he said, "It'll just take a second. Can you please just pour me some water in my room?" At this point, we already knew this wasn't right, so we said no again. This conversation went back and forth for about 3 minutes until he tried to walk into our room. Our instincts kicked in at this point, and I ran towards the door and said, "Sir, we're good," and I slammed the door on him. Ava and I sat in the hotel room for about 10 minutes panicking on how we were going to leave to talk to our parents because we had left our phones downstairs. We looked out of the peephole and he was gone, so we bolted down the hallway and ran back down the stairs to the restaurant. Once we told our stepmom, she was mortified and went to office security. They interviewed us and asked for his description because they didn't have any cameras in the hallway. We gave them the description, and they told us that nobody with that description worked there, and that most of them were young, broke college students. At that point, it really set in that if I had accepted and just helped him, I might have died. So everyone, teach your kids stranger danger. And creepy hotel guy, let's not meet again. I Was Hiding from Your Mom. My Mom is Dead by Jerris Underwear. One of the creepiest stories I know personally is from my best friend when he was home at his house babysitting a friend's kid. The kid, whose name was Junior, was roughly 4 or 5, I want to say. His dad was a courier, so would often be out doing deliveries late at night. David, my best friend, was a teen by this point, so being home without an adult was no great task. It's important to mention that his father was a pretty paranoid individual who bought into a lot of fear-mongering in the world, so he had cameras set up all over the place. I want to say this happened in 2014. Anyway, David was busy in his bedroom and was minding his own business, but then decided to head into his den, where all the cameras happened to be set up. But the den was locked. David knocked on the door to the den, and Junior opened it up. "Why did you lock the door?" David said. "Because of the lady," Junior said. David asked, "What lady?" "Your mom. I saw her in the kitchen." The house's living room was directly connected to the kitchen, and if you were standing in the kitchen entryway, you could see the door leading outside. It was one of those screened-in sitting areas. Junior claimed that David's mother was right there in the doorway. Really strange, especially considering David's mother had passed away just about 8 months prior. David was chilled by the remark, but the skeptic in him knew that it was likely just Junior's overly active imagination, so he agreed to go and check with him. He brought a kitchen knife, if I'm remembering the story correctly. He walked with Junior down the hallway into the kitchen where the door was open. The door being open was pretty normal. It was a hot summer day and the house trapped a lot of heat. David stepped out onto the screened sitting area and looked left down the ramp his mother used to use to get outside. And there was nothing. He looked to the right, seeing the length of the yard. Nothing. Junior was insistent that there was someone there, which is strange considering usually in situations like these, kids tend to feel better after you poke around for them. David couldn't calm him down. Junior was certain. He kept saying, "I saw your mom. She was here." So David bargained with him. "Everything's recorded on the cameras, so we'll just look at them and we'll know for certain whether someone was there or not." So they sifted through the cameras, and David looked for a timestamp around when Junior claimed that his deceased mother had shown up. He stared down all the cameras as the timer ticked on, and nothing showed up. But suddenly, he watched as the camera showed a figure enter his backyard from the front by pulling the latch. An old woman, at least in her mid-60s, confidently walked into their backyard. She had a cloth grocery bag in her hand. She headed up the ramp and stood in their screened sitting room for a few moments. She then reached for the door to the kitchen, cracking it open. Then she brazenly stepped inside. After some time, Junior saw her in the kitchen and headed to David to tell him. Based on the camera's timestamps, she stood in the kitchen for at least 10 minutes. The absolutely insane part is she left as David went to investigate with Junior. The camera footage showed him looking around and her leaving as he looked around. When he looked left down at the ramp where she'd come up, she had already wrapped around and actually took the long way around, going the length of the yard. When he looked right, he quite literally just missed her. It was genuinely a matter of maybe half a second. Someone wandered right into his backyard and right into his kitchen, then stood there for 10 minutes in his kitchen doing God knows what. Nothing was stolen, nobody was harmed or anything. Well, anyway, the night went on and nothing came of it. Me personally, I would have phoned the police, but David wouldn't. I think there's a chance that his dad may have had some guns that were acquired through perhaps some non-reputable methods. They were locked away from everyone, whatever small comfort that is. But David's instinct was that his dad would likely be furious about the police being called. Anyway, some time passed. Days, weeks, who knows. I'm not even sure how this information came about, but somehow David was told by either a family member or a staff member that the old woman that wandered into the house had dementia and had an episode and just sort of found herself there by a string of coincidences. Our Haunted First Apartment by Lynn Jahaha. Way back in 1972, I was a newlywed to my first husband, Bill the Bum. Yeah, feel the love here. We ran away to Kentucky to get married because you could get married there at 16 years old without parental consent. It was 2 weeks before I turned 18, and I could leave Ohio at 18 as that was, then, considered legal age to do so. A mistake on my part, but I corrected it a few years later. However, that's another story. We were living with his foster parents when we came back to Willoughby. My parents were just glad to see I was alive, but they were less than thrilled with Bill. I grew to understand that later on. At any rate, we were living in Esther's house that was a former boarding house long before I met Bill. One room in the house was haunted by the ghost of a former boarder named Chester, who was an alcoholic and unfortunately passed on there. I've encountered poor Chester, and he was merely confused and not aware of his non-living state until I gently explained it to him, thus helping him to move on to a better existence. We lived with Esther and Dave for about 1.5 years, but it was hardly subliminal. We had very little privacy except for up in our bedroom or when we left every weekend for our playing jobs. We were both guitarists in a 4-piece band. Our drummer, I'll call her S, was also our manager. That way we always had our manager with us. She would find the gigs and negotiate our pay scales, and that was about the only fun I had while married to Bill since he mostly didn't stay employed too long. He had a problem with work called laziness. Those weekend gigs helped keep us in gas and food, though, for several months until I found employment as a nursing assistant in a nearby hospital. Believe it or not, back then $2.25 an hour was a fairly decent wage, and we were able to move out to our first apartment at last. Privacy. The apartment was once a huge century-old mansion that the owners converted into 8 separate apartments, 4 upstairs and 4 down. We got the one on the far left side in the back facing the street. The rent was only $110 a month. I mean, can you believe that? The apartment was so tiny that you could literally stand in the center of the living room and turn around slowly and see the entire apartment without ever leaving that spot. It had the living room, bedroom off of the living room, bathroom off of the bedroom, and the kitchen. The kitchen was the only large section of the whole place, and there was a door in the kitchen that led down to the basement, but we never went down there. We had to wallpaper the living room since it was an ugly puke yellow color, and we laid some nice new linoleum down since the floors were bare wood. We didn't want splinters at our feet. I told the landlords that we were doing it to improve the appearance of the place to our liking, and they didn't expect them to increase the rent as we were doing all the work. They agreed. While we were busy improving the place and setting up housekeeping, we didn't really notice anything right away. Once we had the work completed is when we began to notice some annoying and strange developments. It started out rather subtle at first. We had an apartment directly above us. The other 3 were located in such a way as to have 2 on one side and 2 on the other. It started with some noises above us, usually in the daytime. I mean, no big deal. The sound of other tenants. Or so we thought. Like I said, we didn't give too much credence to it. However, those noises grew louder in intensity, and we heard them day and night, especially when we were trying to sleep. I mean, how rude can you get? We took it for months until it got ridiculous. When Bill was at work one day, I took the initiative to call the landlord and say something about it. When I told the wife about the rude tenant above us keeping us up all night with their racket, I was greeted with silence at first. She told me that she'd look into it, and I let it go at that. I was hoping that the landlords would have a talk with the person living up there and tell him to be more considerate. No such luck. The racket became much more distinctive at night. It actually sounded like someone rolling something around on wheels. Apparently, the floors in all the apartments were bare wood floors, making it easy to hear someone walking around, or moving furniture and the like. We also heard what sounded like they were hammering nails into the plaster walls. That noise was sporadic, but most annoying when you're in bed. We knew there were other tenants upstairs, an old man that lived by himself and an older couple. We didn't know who was in the other 2 apartments. We really didn't neighbor too much. We got pretty fed up with the noisy neighbor above us and decided to go up to the apartment and talk to them ourselves. It appeared that the landlords didn't follow through with their idle promise. Driven by annoyance and sick of being up nights, we marched upstairs to confront our tormentor. We resolutely stood outside of the apartment door and persistently began knocking on it. We got no answer. We kept pounding until we'd get a response. About then, the woman that lived with her husband directly across from that apartment opened her door. She looked to be in her 40s, attractive, and spoke nicely to us, inquiring as to what we were doing. We explained that whoever was living in there was keeping us up practically all night with all the racket they were making. I asked, why don't they open the door? Are they deaf so they can't hear all the noise they're making at all hours? I mean, what's their problem? We're getting quite aggravated about it. The landlord assured us that they talked to them, but nothing's been done so far. She had a rather blank look on her face. She introduced herself and invited us in so she could talk to us. Her husband was at work, but she asked us to sit down, and she offered us some coffee. We were seated at her dining room table as she brought the coffee out to us, and she had a cup with us. She told us not to think she was crazy, but her husband and her had been hearing the same noises since they moved in the year before us. She said hearing what we said made her realize that what her husband and her surmised convinced her that they weren't just bonkers and hearing things. She said that that particular apartment was empty. Our jaws dropped. I mean, even Bill the skeptic was stunned. We told her somebody had to be in there. She confirmed that the only people they ever saw in there were the landlord and his wife when they came by once a week in the mornings to clean it. She said that they'd seen the landlord showing the apartment to several people, yet no one came back or had moved in. She took a deep sip of her coffee and told us with a very serious tone in her voice that her husband and her believed that the place was haunted. I believe my reaction was, "Say what?" She wasn't joking in the least bit. She said that her husband and she were looking for another place to move to because it was beginning to scare them. I asked her if she knew anything as to why it might be haunted, and all she could tell me was that the old man that lived down the hall next door might know something since he had been living there for a number of years. She didn't want to question him since they didn't know him personally and weren't sure how to inquire about it. Fortunately, I was a little braver, and the curiosity was more than I could stand. I waited for my day off from the hospital, and I did notice an old fellow that would periodically sit out on the front porch when the weather permitted it. The house had a wraparound porch, so I just walked around to the front when I saw him outside one day. I introduced myself and told him that we recently moved in around the back. I started some polite conversation, trying not to be too obvious about my curiosity. I asked him how well he was acquainted with his neighbors, and did he like living there, things like that. During the conversation, he mentioned that there was a strange old guy that lived in the apartment opposite him at the end of the hallway. He said that the man had to get around with a wheeled walker because he had difficulty walking. He thought the guy was a little kooky since he was frequently thinking he had to pound nails into the walls to hang things. He wasn't satisfied with his surroundings and was constantly trying to change them. He told me that the guy was rather antisocial and complained all the time. He said that he was living there for about 4 years when the landlord showed up to collect the rent one day, only to find him lying on the bedroom floor. Apparently, he'd had a heart attack. That was that. It began to make sense. This man quite obviously was not aware that he was no longer on the physical plane, and was carrying on with his obsessive habits that he had in real life. I imparted my revelation to Bill, and even he couldn't argue with me about it. We stayed less than a year and moved to a much nicer apartment elsewhere. It wasn't much of a beginning for a newlywed couple in their very first place to find out that it was haunted. Bill turned out to be lazy and a runaround. Our relationship didn't improve too much after leaving, but I couldn't blame a ghost for that. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on my podcast or channel, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. And if you want to take it a step further, find my Patreon link down there too, or think about buying some Uncle Josh Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is down there as well. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.